Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Ekenis. Today we're going to be talking about PHP and Azure. So a little bit about myself. I'm the lead instructor of Coding Dojo's Seattle location. I've had the joy and pleasure of teaching over 400 students how to program in a variety of different languages. In my spare time, I've consulted on a number of different applications, and I try to do stuff that is interesting and challenging. I'm originally self-taught. I started coding at about 18 years old, soon after high school, and pursued it seriously a couple years later. I'm passionate about the lifecycle of new applications, so seeing something from creation into the act of actually completion and all the steps in between. I am a local Seattleite, and I'm a huge Seahawks fan, an avid basketball player, and lots of people tell you that I'm very good at basketball, but they'd probably be lying. I am new to the dog owner's world. I have a golden doodle puppy named Freya, and she's a fuzzy little nightmare of fun and bundle of joy. So let's talk a little about what we're going to do today. Today we're going to talk about why are we choosing PHP with Azure services. Next off, we're not actually going to develop anything with PHP today, but we're going to step into a development cycle of our PHP project. After that, we're going to introduce a couple of different technologies, the Azure DB services, the Azure Web App Services, and then finally we're going to bring everything together and deploy our local project up to Azure. At the very end of this, we're going to go ahead and review and look at some resources that are available for us to look at it in our own spare time. So why PHP with Azure? Now this is a very good question. Basically, what I want to pose to you guys is what is a challenge that we could face as a local developer and when we're developing a project? And then what is Azure and why would we use Azure to help us get that development project out to the real world? And also, what is PHP and why would we end up using PHP? And we'll kind of go through some pros and cons of using PHP in general. So I want to present us with the challenge. The challenge is kind of what we're going to do here. We have a local application. We can allow users to access our application, or we really want users to access our application. And our application is currently storing information onto our hard drive, and it's on an actual personal computer that's not really accessible to the rest of the world. Now, that's not very good because we really want a dedicated machine that's going to be secure, easy to use, and allow incoming traffic and exiting traffic to come in and out of our system. Not only that, but if we get a lot of users, we kind of want to scale up and make a lot of these different machines. Instead of just having one personal computer that has a couple of faults, such as I have personal information on here that I don't want people to access in their spare time. And also I have the handy dandy trick of turning off my computer at any point, which I do quite a lot. So we don't really want that to happen very much. So how are we going to solve this little challenge that we have? Well, we need to place a house our application, a cloud server. And we'll kind of cover what a cloud server in general is in a little bit. But a cloud server is very important for a variety of different reasons. First off, most modern websites are hosted on the cloud. There are three big reasons as to why they're going to be hosted on the cloud. They're very cost-effective, secure, and they're easy to actually manage. We could get a project up in a matter of 10 minutes, which actually we'll be doing a little bit later on today. Not only that, but there's a dedicated process and performance enhancement just by having a dedicated machine that can handle all of our application in one mainframe. So there's not really that kind of splitting of duty. You know, you're not going to launch up a game and play it or browse the internet during your spare time on your server. You're just going to use it only for what it does, which is serving files to a client. So I really just wanted to talk about what a cloud server is, and kind of boils down to what a server is in general. A server is really any computer, like my own personal computer, or in the case of what we're going to get into, an environment of a dedicated machine that is going to be actually a small little chunk of that dedicated machine that will end up going ahead and processing requests and sending back a response. I have a nice little diagram here of what the request and response cycle looks like, but generally a client is going to request a website such as www.bing.com. And the server is going to listen for that request to come on in and send back a response to that client, in this case, a search engine. Same thing can happen with Facebook, MSN.com, and Twitter, and all those other things. Generally, a server is a web server, and it has a database server in conjunction with it. And that's where we're going to be focusing on today. Now, the client can only understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It can't do anything else. All a browser can read are those three things. So in the background of our server, we can use a variety of different programming languages, of different logical operations, and a different database as well to house all of our storage information. But all that really matters to the client is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and how we go about giving that back to it. Now, at this point, I kind of want to discuss what is Azure. Well, Azure is really a cloud platform and system. It goes from a variety of different things, from virtual machines, load balancers, databases, web app hosting. It's currently advancing into the Internet of Things, and there's a ton of different actual products that Azure offers. It has some great interaction and integration with Visual Studio, which I would love to show off, but unfortunately I won't be doing that today. So for those that are using Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, there's some good interaction there. Azure comes pre-built with a bunch of nice templates that we can go ahead and, as a developer, use to our advantage to really get our project up and running. And it'll allow us to kind of focus on the different aspects of what we really want to do, kind of dig into the core of what we want our product to be, and allows us to really get a project up and running as quickly as possible. Now, Azure is really, really unique because there's a private and secure network that exists behind Azure that allows different applications, different services to talk to each other. So in our example today, when we're using a dedicated web server and a dedicated database server, the communication between those two applications is going to be very private and very secure. So there's no scary loss of data or kind of network hacking that could possibly happen. Azure is really cool because it's easily scalable. Due to some fine tuning that you can do in your application, you can kind of launch up a ton of servers and downgrade as needed automatically, which of course has an added benefit of being very cost effective. We can go ahead and just use the fact that we are using Azure to its advantage to really save us money. And kind of one of the core technologies that's laying underneath Azure is machine learning. Due to machine learning, we can kind of tell the performance indicators of how well our web server and our database are running. And due to that, we can really save some money and really pump out some resources when we need to, and really downgrade our resources when there's downtime in our traffic. Now, Azure is not only for enterprise-level applications, which it heavily supports, but it's also for personal, small applications like one that we're going to do today. And due to that, it's kind of spread across a variety of different things that is going to allow any user to kind of walk into Azure with some familiarity and some ability to get a great product up and running. So today we're going to talk about why we're going to use Azure. I mean, we kind of listed out like what is Azure and how some of the cool features about it, but there's really like a wide variety of different reasons why we're going to choose Azure to do our development of our cloud server and our cloud database instead of other places. First off, there's easy to use tools like we talked about. In a couple of clicks, we could get some nice, great services up and running, get them communicating with each other. So that brings us back to that quick launching of an application and a server in general. These technologies work together very, very well. And there's some really advanced features that we could dig into as an experienced developer or even an entry-level developer that are really going to help us on out. So we're going to try to take advantage of whatever we can to really help get us going. Now, one of the really, really cool things about Azure that I want to highlight, but we're not going to delve into, is the hybrid cloud solutions. A hybrid cloud solution means that instead of having stuff externally out there in the cloud, you can also have stuff locally or in different cloud services as well. And Azure will support and kind of help direct that traffic as needed. So allowing you to have something like a house like literally in your basement or on the cloud or in some other instance altogether. But we're going to use Azure with PHP. So kind of what is PHP? Well, PHP is a programming language that is perfectly suited for web development. It provides static websites, dynamic websites, and handles most of your traditional web applications. You could think your e-commerce, your blogs, your traditional websites, your mom and pop shops, that type of stuff it is perfectly for, as well as large-scale enterprise applications such as banking systems. It's generally considered one of the popular LAMP stacks. You could probably describe it more as an AMP stack because today we're using it on a Mac, and then we're also pushing it up to a Windows machine that's run on Azure. So it's kind of very flexible in where it can host. Now, PHP is designed not only for newcomers to step into the fold and kind of just jump right in with their first programming language. They'll be very flexible and very friendly, but also experienced developers love it as well because there's a lot of advanced features you could delve into. It's one of the most adaptive technologies and programming languages you can have. It's able to fit almost any need at all, except for a couple of select use cases. But for the most variety of web applications, it is perfect. Now, PHP has been around for a very long time. There's a great amount of community and support that's built into the PHP world. I mean, there's PHP meetups all around, and there's PHP developers all around, and you're likely to run into one at any point. One of the really cool statistics about PHP is that it makes up 82% of all available web servers out there. So it is a very popular and in-demand language. Matter of fact, there are a couple of really large companies that use it daily. Facebook, Wikipedia, Twitter, Badaboo, as well as also, also there are 42 million live websites that use it daily. And that's just right now what is live, not even talking about legacy servers that might be in use at some point or what is currently actively in development. In a recent survey from last year, PHP was described as the 5th most popular language. So it's going to be around, it has been around, and will most likely always be around. So at this point, I kind of want to talk about the pros and cons of PHP. I'm going to start with the cons because they're kind of already been mentioned, and just kind of just talk about them a little bit in general. So some of the cons of using PHP is that it's going to be an older language. It's been around for a very long time. It doesn't really quite have as many bells and whistles as some of the newer languages on out there like Go or Swift or whatever it might be. One of the biggest flaws of PHP in general is that it's not typically an object-oriented language, but you can create it as such. Due to the fact that it's an older language, there's some inconsistent function names, it's considered long-winded, there's some complicated designs that are laying underneath most PHP applications, and previously there was a lack of direction, which allowed a lot of legacy baggage to kind of seep into PHP in general. Now, the pros far outweigh any cons that can be there. First off, there's a very large community. There's plenty of people that have developed in PHP, and there's plenty of support. I mentioned previously that there was a lack of direction in the PHP world. Well, there's been more direction provided in recent years over the fact that there's actually been a panel that's been assembled to kind of help push PHP forward, which has allowed it to constantly evolve with the trending technologies of the world. I mean, PHP 7 just recently came on out, and it's looking very, very well for experienced developers and newcomers to jump in due to this performance enhancements that has gone into it. We already mentioned this a little bit, but it's easy for newcomers to come pick on up. And even those that are experienced developers who are new to the PHP world to come right in and get familiar with the language and get to working with it. It is one of the most flexible languages you can have out there. It is easy to incorporate with other technologies. Today we're going to also put an Angular app on top of what we're developing in. So it works well perfectly with any variety of technologies. But it's mostly designed to work in conjunction with most typical web applications. So your e-commerce, your blog posts, all the sites we already mentioned before. Now there are plenty of jobs in PHP because there are a lot of large companies that use PHP still. And it's never going to kind of leave that frame. It's always going to be around and always going to be in development. Cool. So now let's just go ahead and take a look at a review of what we just talked about, because there's a lot of meat in the slide. But basically we have two different technologies. We have PHP, a programming language. There are many different languages that we could pick from, but PHP is a standard in the industry. It's easy to pick up, easy to develop in. And not only that, but it will work well with any technology and environment we throw it in. Now, Azure is going to be where we end up hosting our application. There's a great support system, and there's a ton of different tools that we can integrate into Azure to really take take advantage of our application in the most variety of ways. And because of the built-in infrastructure already provided in Azure, it allows us to kind of take advantage of the fact that Azure is going to do most of the heavy lifting. And all we really have to do is kind of get our code out there and do a couple of configuration settings, and we're good to go. So PHP with Azure, I mean, this is kind of our chance to showcase that Azure and PHP working together is really awesome. It actually works very friendly with each other. Due to the fact that PHP has been around for a while, it tends to work well in most cloud servers. But with Azure in general, Azure is pre-built to already support PHP, not only just PHP the legacy code, but also PHP the newer code, so up to PHP 7 as well. Due to that fact that they can work perfectly well together, there's a real stable server that is presented to us. So we can actually use that stable server to actually assume that by and large, our application is going to work in a standard way without any kind of unfamiliar issues arising. Not only that, but kind of the incorporation of these different services allows us to take advantage of the fact that we can scale up or scale down our application as needed, monitor our application and the resources that are being used, and also the fact that we can kind of branch out and really pull in other technologies and other Azure instances to really help supplement our application anyway. Welcome back. So right now we're going to step into our development cycle. So we have a PHP project, and we kind of want to know where we are in our PHP project. Like we talked about previously, we are not going to actively develop in PHP, but we're going to step into an already developed project at the end of the cycle right before we actually release it out to the public and put it onto a cloud server. So in order to kind of cover that, we want to talk about what technologies are we using, because we want to kind of mimic those when we get to that Azure side of stuff. Where are we stepping in at? So kind of just like a broad overview of what our project is, show it working locally. And the next kind of longer section is where do we go from here? We have our working project. What do we need to replicate on the Azure side to get that project up and running? So really quickly, what technologies are we using locally? Well, we're using PHP as our programming language that's handling all of our logic and communicating between handling the request and sending back a response. And that also includes communicating with a database. We're using CodeIgniter as a MVC framework. That way we can have a nice large-scale active development cycle and a development team for our traditional web application. Now, we're using an Apache server to actually host all of this, including our MySQL database. Apache will go ahead and help interpret our PHP-based project, and MySQL will actually be the development place that we save all of our working data into a very friendly GUI that we can actually look at live. And lastly, like I said, PHP is very flexible, so I actually threw an Angular front-end framework on top of our application to allow us to get a single-page application going that is going to look kind of nice and allow the users to interact with our page in a very quick and easy fashion. At this point, I kind of want to mention where we're stepping into our application. So a view from 10,000 feet up. Our current project is just literally Apache hosting in it. There's some CRUD operations involved in our project, which will allow us to alter and create new data in our database. We're connected to a MySQL instance that is available that we can see that data kind of enter into and kind of refresh it and see the changes happen. But really, there's a ways to go to get this app accessible to the outside world. And a matter of fact, we're going to actually take a look at our local project running live in a quick demo. Hey everybody, so at this point we're going to go ahead and look over our local project to show where we currently are and look at the technologies that we want to mimic on the external web server and database server that we're going to go ahead and create. So here's our local project. You can actually see us locally hosted. That is on port 8888. There's actually an Angular app there as well. And we could go ahead and take a look at kind of our simple CRUD application involving dragons. Here I am, and I happen to be blue, even though I'm a fire element. So let's edit that and take a look at a different color of red. Cool. And my move is sleep, because that seems to be a great move. Not only that, but we're going to go ahead and delete John, our dragon. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our database to see if that's actually been changed and updated as well. There I am, the color of red, and we can actually see that this is a kind of a local project, so we're actually going to take this whole entire application and push it out somewhere. Meanwhile, our database over here is going to be housed in a whole different server. And we're going to mimic what MySQL does here without the nice interface, and we're also going to go ahead and change and alter some syntax in here because we're going to actually push up to a SQL database instead of a MySQL instance. And now at this point, we're going to actually go into kind of some of the nitty-gritty of what's about to happen in the next couple of modules. All right, so now is kind of time to go ahead and take our local project and break off the different steps that we're going to take in order to get that local project out into an external server, from a database server to also a web server in general. Now, there are kind of three parts to this. Basically, we have something locally saved and we want to get it to the cloud. We need to break off that into workable chunks. So the first workable chunk we're going to talk about is taking our MySQL database and transferring over to an Azure SQL database. So this is kind of our starting point right now. We're locally hosted. We have it all together in one. We're going to start splitting these different parts on out. Now, part two is about taking our Apache hosted app and actually making a web app through Azure that will host our code base. And the last little part is configuring our local code to work together with these two different systems and then pushing that up to that instance that we're going to be creating in part two. So now to kind of take a look over the different steps. Part one is about the database server. This is where we're going to transfer MySQL into that Azure DB server. So Even though our locally saved data works perfectly, it's local. Once again, we want to kind of avoid that as much as we can. So we're going to set up our Azure DB instance. We're going to determine which database we want and also how we're going to use it. We're going to configure to match our current database text. So we're going to keep that in mind. We kind of want to mirror whatever we have locally because we know our local version works. Let's go ahead and not alter too much what we're about to do when we export it out to the external database server. Now, the second part is about kind of taking our locally hosted web app and actually creating an external web app. In that locally hosted web app, it was fantastic. We can actually use Azure to mimic a little bit of the settings. So we're going to set that Azure app instance to kind of work with those settings. And actually, to get it to that point right there is very easy. It's just actually clicking a couple buttons. So then we're going to configure our instance to support PHP, which happens actually internally. It is actually designed to support PHP in general, as well as a couple of frameworks like .NET, Node, Java, and everything else. So we're going to configure our external web server to account for that. Part 3, this is the last part, and it's actually one of the easier parts, minus a couple of little configuration things that we do. We're going to take our local code base and transfer it up to our web server. So we need to edit our local code base to meet any configurations that did happen previously. That includes communicating from our web server within our external database server, altering our code base to make those requests, maybe even creating that Azure SQL database right then and there and the different code products that go along with it. After that's done, we transfer our code base up to our external server, and then that's really it. We're done. We can check out our application and get going. And at this point, we now have a finished project that is all hosted on the cloud that looks something like this: an external web server that accepts requests, that has a local code base that is actually going to communicate to our external database server, which has inside of it an Azure SQL database that's going to be the only focus of that server instance. And at this point, we could go ahead and actually start getting into the part 1 of what we're about to do, which is setting up our Azure SQL database server. Welcome back. So now that we kind of laid out what different parts there are to getting our locally versioned PHP project onto the cloud, we could kind of delve into what part 1 of that is, which is setting up an Azure DB service to account for the fact that we did have a MySQL database. So at this point, we could kind of delve into what is an Azure DB service. So taking a look at kind of our outlook for this presentation portion is also which database service will we end up using. Luckily, Microsoft and Azure has provided a lot of different databases for a lot of different needs that a developer might have. And lastly, we're going to kind of look at what are the launching and configuration of the database instance. And then finally, we're going to finish off with a very quick demo on actually doing that. So getting into part 1 of this is about what is an Azure database service. Well, first and foremost, like all of the stuff we're about to do is hosted on the cloud. So it's going to be separate of our local application. It's going to be actually its own server. Now, Azure has provided a list of different technologies that meet every single need and requirement that a developer might have. Not only that, but there's a lot of really cool integrations that we can have, such as the ability to scale up our application very quickly. There's some backup systems in case we have some sudden loss of data. There's an ease of access between multiple different applications, Azure applications, to work together with this data set, as well as other external cloud-hosted instances as well. Azure database services are very adaptive to fit our needs. They'll scale up, scale down, use resources as we require, scale vertically, scale horizontally. And then also kind of one of the bonuses of using Azure in general is the integration of different systems and different technologies. So we will actually choose the right technology to meet our requirements, but that doesn't limit the fact that we can't have multiple different technologies working together here. So like I mentioned, Azure has a ton of different services, and they're not just kind of related to just the different technologies that lay underneath it, but there really are 2 different categories that Azure database services will generally fall in, either relational databases or non-relational databases. And at this point, you could probably guess that the relational databases are going to be your SQL databases, where data relates to other data, where me, myself as Chris, can have a blog. Now, I can have many different blogs, but a blog that I create will always be owned by me. That data relates to each other. It allows the normalization of that data, and is standard for most web applications. Now, a non-relational database is going to be a little bit different, where most data, as you can imagine, does not relate to each other. It's unique data sets. And there's some bonuses with doing that, such as a quick insertion of data and the quick retrieval of data. But the actual act of making data relate to each other is very hard to do, but you can kind of twist this arm enough to make it work. So it's very specialized, and for most cases, we won't need to use it. Now, the power of using Azure as a database service is the auto performance suggestions that are there, the threat detection that might happen, so incoming network that might try to access your database, the automation scripts that are provided as well, which you can take advantage of in order to update, delete, alter data as needed, create data as needed as well. It allows an easy ability to scale up and down our web app services and kind of branch out into multiple different ones. We could diagnose kind of how much of our database is being used, when the kind of hard points are, when kind of the softer downturns are. And using this kind of resource utilization guide, we can actually set up our application to get the most bang for our buck and really try to be very cost effective with how we're using the service. So today what we're going to kind of cover is going to be the launching of a database service, picking the correct database service, which is going to be a SQL database, because we want to kind of relate that to what we're doing in MySQL, and we're going to set up any basic configuration we can. And at this point, we could kind of make some quick assumptions. First off, that you can set up and create an Azure account and go to the Azure portal. The creating of a MySQL database, like I already mentioned before, we want to mimic whatever we have locally hosted on our external servers. So if we use MySQL, we would probably want to look for a MySQL database. And there actually is a way to find a MySQL database in Azure, but we're actually going to alter that into a SQL database where we can have multiple different SQL instances up and running if the need arises. So we're going to grab that SQL database, configure the base information to include a name, a description, a resource group, and then actually create the server itself. So we could create the database, and that database is going to be housed on a local server, or not a local server, an external server. And that database, since it's hosted somewhere, it can be scaled up and down as needed through the help of Azure, and configuring that database server is going to be very easy. It's going to kind of mimic what we did for our SQL database itself, where we need the server name, the admin info, and the location info, like where your server is going to be located in the world. The admin info is very important, and I'm going to kind of touch on this real quick, because that's going to be how we actually access our database. That's going to be our way to unlock the door and enter into our server. So definitely keep that information in mind, and we'll kind of cover that as well. After that, in the span of a couple minutes, we're done. We have an Azure SQL database instance up and running that will meet any need that we have. All right, so at this point, we've kind of laminated out the different steps for launching a database server through Azure. But now we actually need to do it. So we're actually going to walk that process together in order to get one up and running. So let's go ahead and look at the Azure portal. I'm assuming that you've created an account and you've set up all your account information. If you go into the Azure portal, you're greeted by a nice resource screen. Over here on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a lot of different technologies. Now, the one we're going to be using is a SQL database. So we're going to go ahead and load that on up. And all we really want to do is add one. So we're going to click on the Add button and get to going. Now we can name our database any type of any type of name that we possibly want, but we want it to be pretty descriptive. In this case, we're going to do a Dragons database, and then we have a description model that we're going to use. We're going to create a new resource group called Dragons, and that's just going to be kind of how we house all of our different resources and instances that we're going to run. Remember, Azure is really good about setting up a broad range and scope of different services that could work together. So it's kind of going to be how we track them all. We have a blank database, and we want a different server, not the Dragon test server, but a different one, hopefully called Dragons. As you can see, there's a real big theme here, but it's very descriptive. Now our admin information is going to be kind of unique. This is going to be our key to unlock that door to access this database and this server in general. So let's go with Chris, and then we can go with a nice, you guys are all going to see my super secret password a little bit later on, but we'll keep it as a nice, fun little hidden password for now. The location is very specific towards where in the world we want to house this server instance. I'm going to choose on the West Coast because that's where I'm based. And then we're going to go ahead and select and go ahead and pin this to the dashboard and create. Now, of course, there already is a Dragons app out there. So we're going to say Dragons NVA. And hopefully there's no resource group of that same name. And there we go. So now it's going to submit our application to be deployed. And in a few minutes time, it's just going to deploy itself actually on some West Coast server that we can go ahead and access. So we're going to let that happen in the background. At this point, you should be good to go in terms of actually having a deployed SQL database up and running. All right, so now we're on to our next topic. So this is going to be part 2 of what we kind of laid out a little bit earlier today. So this is going to be the Azure Web App Services portion. It's going to be broken into kind of 3 to 4 different parts. Basically, we have what are the Azure Web App Services, how we're going to utilize them to kind of develop our local PHP project and push it on out to that external web server. And then the last little portion is going to be how do we launch and configure it. And that's actually going to be really easy, and we're going to showcase that off as well. And so get down to the nitty-gritty. What are the Azure Web App Services? Well, like we already talked about before, everything's going to be hosted on the cloud now at this point. But Azure provides a lot of really built-in tools to help us kind of get us up and running really quickly. So there's very easy deployment tools that are utilized in the Azure Web App Services. Now we can integrate and monitor a bunch of different features and services that might be required, as well as kind of using those different features and services, we can actually monitor the performance. And due to the monitoring of our performance, we can kind of tell when the most traffic comes into our application, and when we want to kind of scale up or scale down or utilize more resources or kind of find the right time to tone it back down again. So it allows us a whole lot of nice little performance metrics that we can actually utilize in our application. Now, this isn't only for PHP-based projects, by the way, but it is very helpful for PHP-based projects. But you can actually utilize .NET, Java, a whole bunch of different frameworks and languages with these web app services. And so because of that, I mean, you're not ever going to be kind of tethered into where you are. Now, our web app service is going to be on the cloud, so there might be a shared or dedicated virtual machine that we are going to access. So we're going to push all of our projects up to that little portion of a gigantic server, just due to the fact that we have a very small project, but we shouldn't be concerned about any security issues or loss of data or anything like that. Azure does a great job of securing where you are in that shared environment. Now, how are we going to end up utilizing these Azure Web App Services for our project? Well, we're going to start off by first and foremost creating that web app. And we'll walk through those steps here in a minute. Now, we're going to create that web app, and because we already created that Azure SQL database instance, we're going to go ahead and put those two things together, and then finally we're going to launch our application on out there. And they're going to be kind of tethered to each other, and they're going to know about each other's instances. And due to that fact, we can kind of take advantage of the fact that we're integrating these different systems that are across all of Azure together. So how do we do that? Well, we already kind of talked about the Azure SQL database instance and how we launched those, and there are quite a few steps in that one. This one's pretty bare bones, actually. We just need to actually create the web application. So we're just going to click a plus and get going. We need to configure the information about the names, the subscription, the resource group, and we're going to tie our resources together. We're going to create it, and that's going to be it. We're just going to hit a button, and we're done. We now have a shell of our project at this point that we can then change and alter our code base to work in that nice shell in that environment. So at that point, we're done. And that's actually going to be what we do next. We're going to showcase this going on off in a live demo. All right, so now we're actually going to work ahead and launch our own web app live. So we're actually going to go to our Azure portal. This is the main dashboard. As you can see, we have our SQL database up already, fully deployed and online, which is fantastic. Now, we need to add a new resource. We need to add a new server. So we're going to go ahead and click that new button, look in our web marketplace, and there's a nice web app. Exactly what we're looking for. As you can see from the description, enjoy secure and flexible development, deployment, and scaling options for your web app. Like I said, Azure is all about kind of helping you on out. Let's go ahead and click it on open. What's a good name for our app? I don't know. Dragons MVA is a fantastic name for it. Now, we already have an existing resource group that we could tether this to, and then we can monitor all of our resources together. Let's go ahead and take a look. I actually have quite a few, including the name of my dog and cat in there. But now we're actually going to tether it to the previous resource group we created, that we can monitor all of them together. We're going to pin this to the dashboard. We're going to go ahead and press create. And just like that, we should be good to go. It's validating our information and submitting our deployment and finally deploying. And just like what happened with our SQL database before, it's going to take a little bit for it to launch, but it shouldn't be more than a couple minutes. And it'll come pre-configured to work with PHP, work with our SQL database instance, and ready to kind of tether those two pieces together. So, and that should be about it. And it'll wrap up here in a couple more minutes. Next up, we're actually going to go ahead and configure our local code base. And so join us for that. Hey everybody, welcome back. So at this point, we actually have most of our project done. We have a SQL instance up and running on Azure. We also have a web app up and running on Azure. This is going to be about actually taking our local code base and deploying it onto the Azure instance, and then setting up that local code base to work well with our different systems. So in order to kind of cover this, is going to be basically two main parts of this, plus a demo at the end. First and foremost, we should probably configure our local code base with the fact that we are now deploying to a web app. So we need to know what our URL is and kind of our database connection as well. And there's going to be a couple small alterations to our code base we'll cover during the demo. Mostly the fact that we are using a different database technically, and so some of the syntax is a little bit different, but not really made a whole lot. Finally, once we made those changes, we can upload our code to our web app itself, and there'll be a nice little process that kind of takes place and some really cool stuff that Azure does for us. So in order to configure our local code base we already talked about, we need to take care of the Azure URL that we are provided with. We need to connect to our database. We need to convert some syntax. And also the last thing that we need to do, since we have the connection to our database, is actually create the tables inside of our database. Because we never have actually done that. But there's some nice, good code that we can actually use that will actually run a script that will do that for us. Now, the second part of this is actually uploading our code base to our web app. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. There's a multitude of different ways. A lot of different ways that Azure could pull in resources, from you just uploading it through a zip file and pushing your code out to GitHub, which is going to be what we end up doing, or pulling it down from Dropbox, whatever it might be. And the benefit to using something like GitHub is that we can have version control management already ingrained in it. And you can watch our master branch, and if there are any changes to our master branch, we will then pull in those changes then. And so it allows you to really have full control of the different features and branches that are going on. And when we merge it on back in, we don't have any downtime with that server. It just updates live, which is really a powerful tool with Azure that is really awesome, and I can't highlight that enough. But once we have our application on up, we can then go ahead and run our SQL create script. It'll actually create our database table in a multitude of different tables if we really wanted to. And at that point, we should have a working application, and we could test it on out and see what's happening. So the next step that we're going to get into are kind of those finishing touches that we previously talked about. So please join us for that demo and see what happens. All right, everybody. So now it's time for those finishing touches that we talked about. So this is going to be the tying together of our shell of what our web app is, and also what our Azure SQL instance that is already up and running, and tying those two things together and tethering them together. We're going to use our local code base to actually do that. So looking back over at our Azure dashboard, we do have our web app up and running. We actually even also have our SQL database up and running. And we need pieces of information from both of those in order to tether them together. Now, the first portion that we need to tether will be our web URL. So if we were to click this is actually our URL right now of what our web app is. Now, it's going to be kind of a blank screen because there really is no project. And as you can see from the blank screen, yay, it got successfully created. But this URL is actually going to be the base URL of our project. So we can actually copy that, go on over to our configuration of our local project, and there's a base URL. This is usually important for most PHP projects because, and actually just mostly in development practices in general, is that your local host is no longer your base URL. You actually have an actual URL to tether to. And your project has to be aware of that. Now, as you could guess by the fact that we have our database.php open, there is some configuration we have to do here, mostly in the fact that we have a local host that we were previously connecting to, but now we are not. So going back into our resource tab, we can go ahead and take a look at our dashboard and reassess. Our SQL database houses our information right over here. If we were to look at that, we could kind of see that there's a server name that is available. Not only that, but there's also a list of connection strings that actually show the connection planned out. And this is really important for a couple of different ways. First and foremost, so there's a nice, easy connection portal that we're going to use. This actual snippet of code is perfect. One of the cool things about Azure is it's constantly being updated by the development team at Azure. So even something like this is pretty new before we have to tether it in by actually parsing out a long string ourselves. So going back in, I'm actually going to paste that guy here to parse out a couple of different pieces of information. First and foremost, I need to know what our URL of our database is, how we're going to access it. That's going to be our host name right there. Our username was Chris, which is great. And now at this point, we can take a look at my super secret password, which is password1, exclamation point. Our database that we're still going to use is going to be Dragons, but the SQL Server is going to be a little bit different. We're going to actually use the SQL Server DB driver. So at this point, we actually have a running bit of code instance, and I'm actually going to take this guy on out and delete it at this point. And we're actually going to use that information elsewhere, but at this point, we can go ahead and jump to that step here in just a second. All right, so we actually created previously a dbcreate.php, which actually connected to our instance of our database and would run a simple command. In this case, it's going to run a create table. Now, we do need to change some of this alteration. First and foremost, our password is slightly different. It's password1. Our name is going to be Chris. And our URL, I believe, if we look back at our database.php, was Dragons. Even better. Now, all that this really does is makes a connection to our SQL Server and allows us to use that connection to run a quick script. In this case, we're going to run a create table script. All this is going to do is create our Dragons table and then execute it, hopefully. Now, it might die along the way, but if it has not, we'll get a table created tag to pop on up to let us know that it actually worked, which is great. But it will allow us to create a variety of different tables and in a variety of different ways. At this point, you might notice that this is not truly MySQL language and syntax, but it's actually now SQL syntax. So be sure to make that adjustment as needed for your own self. Now, the last little portion that we have to do is alter any of our actual code base that was in MySQL into that SQL syntax. So looking into our application of our nice CodeIgniter project, there's only really one small thing to change for the most part, is that instead of now, I believe it has get. I believe SQL itself uses get date as the only change in terms of our actual SQL syntax that we were using before. So these two different languages, even though they're two different technologies and they're hosted in two different ways, are very, very similar. So quickly look up that syntax as needed and make that adjustment if you can. All right, so at this point, we should have all of our code base configured. And there were only really about 4 different changes that we had to make, and even a lot of it was supplied by the Azure team itself. So I already recently pushed up this project to GitHub. It's a fantastic project that you can go ahead and take a look at right here. There's only been one commit, but we just made an update to our code base. So at this point, we can go ahead and supply the fact that we have some new changes. So let's add it to our repository. We'll keep it very, very generic and git push it on out. Now, once these changes are on out, we should be able to now pull it into our web server in general. We have a script that we can run to create our database. We have a database connection already active and hopefully working. We configured our PHP project to use our base URL now. And we even changed some of the syntax, so then hopefully there won't be any discrepancies between the MySQL syntax we used previously to now the SQL syntax we're using right now. The last little bit that we have to do, and this is the real hard part, I would say, because it's probably the best and coolest part of all this, is in our web app, we can actually configure where we're extracting this deployment information from. In our deployment options tab under app deployment, we could choose a source of where our code base is located. Like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of different places that we could hide our code base. But the one that we're going to use today is GitHub. And I love the fact that we get to use GitHub, and you can set up the authorization of your account. I already did. And it'll look through and parse any different kind of projects you have available. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and grab our project we just created, choose a different branch if we want to. We're going to pull from the master branch. So Azure is actually going to watch our GitHub repo, and once this branch is updated, update our code base as well. Let's press OK. It's setting up our deployment source right now, and it should be all done. And actually, if we go back to, yay, it's all done. Cool. All right, so now if we go to our overview, that's okay. We can see that nothing really has happened so far. But if we go to our deployment options, we should see that it is still fetching our project, which is great. This should wrap up very soon. All right, so now that we have synced up with GitHub, it took about 1 minute to really kind of sync up with GitHub in our repo, but Azure went out and pulled down that repo and actually built it for us without any configuration that we did on our end. It was already ready to go to determine that it was PHP based, and went ahead and actually launched it. So now at this point, we could go to our Azure website URL, which I believe we already actually have up, refresh, and it probably won't work, mostly because we don't actually have a created database, but you can see that I actually did pull up our first project. Now, remember, we made that script, and it was called db_create.php. And we're going to actually run that script to create our project, create our database, I would say, and that will actually go ahead and create those different tables, allowing us to interact with our database live. Let's go ahead and run it. Table created, fantastic. Let's go back to our main project, and let's make a dragon. All right, let's put myself in red, fire, ember, slash, sleep, create dragon. And there we go. We have it working live right now with the working database. Now, the last change you might want to make if you're actually in production mode is to delete that db_create script. And that way nobody else can just randomly create your database, but it won't work for the most part. And there we go. Now we have a final product that's already up, deployed with a web app that is housing our local, or that was housing our local repository, but now is housing our GitHub repository. Any changes we make to our GitHub will be pulled and push this code base live instantaneously. It might take a little bit to build, but it will be up there shortly. And we have our code base connected to our external SQL server that will be completely and absolutely scalable in any way that we want to, and allow us to enhance our performance of our database as needed. Not only that, because our web app is already done and working, we can now assume that we can scale up, scale down, use resources, and pull in different technologies and instances of Azure that we might want to use. And there we go. We're all done with our deployment. So next up, we're going to go ahead and review what we did today and look at some extra available resources that there are out there. Thank you very much. All right, everybody, so this is our last section together. We're going to kind of recap what we did today and also talk about some extra additional resources that you can get invested in if you're interested in more on this subject. So looking ahead, kind of just a quick review about what we did. First off, we started with an overview of what today would end up bringing and the challenge that we were presented with. We discussed a little bit about why we're going to choose PHP and why we're going to work with Azure in general. We went through our development cycle in PHP, where we were in our project, where we wanted to go. And then we started along the long road of getting our project to that point. We introduced Azure Database Services, introduced the Azure Web App Service, and finally we deployed some sample code up to Azure and made it work with our different systems together. Now, there's a large amount of subjects we covered. At this point, I'd like to recommend that if you have any additional need and kind of joy into delving into some different technologies and learning more about the subject matter, to please go ahead and check out some of the PHP tutorials at php.net. Coding Down, the framework I use, is available with a couple of additional tutorials there as well. And remember, now Microsoft Virtual Academy has a lot of additional resources on kind of delving deeper into SQL instances, web apps, getting into some of the additional resources that you can pull into your application at any point. And feel free to reach me on Twitter or by email as well. At this point, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun coding up our project, getting it on out there for the world to see. and kind of play around with. And I hope you guys stick around for some more additional Microsoft Virtual Academy courses. Thank you very much.